Blood trickled down Jallen King's face as Officer Grayson laughed, pressing the handcuffs tighter. "Special Forces, Dad, huh?" he sneered. Then the station door swung open. Complete silence fell as Commander Isaiah King entered, his Delta Force insignia gleaming. Jallen smiled through his tears. "Before we dive into this powerful story about justice and accountability, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe in standing up against discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. Now let's rewind to see how a routine day turned into a life-changing confrontation for a young man who simply wanted to be treated with dignity. Jallen King had always been exceptional, maintaining a 4.0 GPA at Westridge High School in Pinecrest, Virginia, despite the constant undercurrent of prejudice that followed him through the hallways like an unwelcome shadow. At 16, he'd already developed the kind of resilience most adults never achieve, a necessity for a young black man in a predominantly white community where his achievements were often attributed to quotas rather than his brilliant mind. His mother, Tanya King, had raised him with unwavering strength during the long absences of his father, Isaiah, whose classified work in military special operations meant he was more myth than presence in their home. The few times Isaiah returned, between deployments, he would spend hours teaching Jallen about dignity and self-respect, lessons that grew increasingly vital as his son navigated the treacherous waters of adolescence in America. "Never let them provoke you into forgetting who you are," Isaiah would say, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Your response to hatred says more about you than their actions say about them." These words became Jallen's mantra, especially when dealing with Officer Richard Grayson, the school resource officer, whose badge seemed to authorize his particular brand of targeted harassment. Grayson had been with the Pinecrest Police Department for 15 years, and complaints about his treatment of minority students had been filed and subsequently buried almost as long. Jallen first caught Grayson's attention when he questioned the officer's aggressive searching of his best friend Devon's locker based on an anonymous tip about marijuana that yielded nothing but embarrassment for Devon and smug satisfaction for Grayson. "You should teach your friend to mind his own business," Grayson later told Devon loudly enough for the crowded hallway to hear. "Smart mouths like his tend to find trouble around here." The implied threat wasn't lost on Jallen, but rather than backing down, he began noticing patterns in Grayson's behavior. How black students were stopped for random checks 3 times more often than their white classmates. How dress code violations were enforced almost exclusively against students of color. How gatherings of black students were quickly dispersed while white students could congregate freely. With Devon's help, Jallen started documenting these incidents, collecting testimonies from other students who'd faced similar treatment. When enough evidence accumulated, Jallen and Devon approached Principal Eleanor Whitman with their findings, expecting her administrative authority would address the clear pattern of discrimination. Instead, they encountered the first major roadblock in their pursuit of justice. "These are serious accusations against a respected officer of the law," Principal Whitman said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically on her desk as she spoke. "I think you boys might be misinterpreting Officer Grayson's dedication to school safety as something more sinister." When Jallen attempted to show her the documentation, including dates, times, and witness statements, she waved it away with a dismissive hand. "I've known Richard Grayson for over a decade. He's not what you're suggesting," she concluded, effectively ending the conversation. As they left her office, Devon punched the wall in frustration. "This is exactly what my dad said would happen. The system protects itself." Jallen placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "Then we need to find someone outside the system," he replied, thinking of his father's lessons about perseverance. That night he tried calling his father, but as usual the call went to voicemail. Isaiah King was somewhere classified, doing something classified, completely unreachable when his son needed him most. Tanya noticed her son's unusual quietness at dinner. "What's going on, Jallen? You've barely touched your food." He considered keeping his concerns to himself, not wanting to add to his mother's burdens while she balanced 2 jobs and graduate school. But the weight of the day's disappointment proved too heavy to bear alone. As he recounted the meeting with Principal Whitman, he watched his mother's expression shift from concern to a familiar steely determination. "Your father and I didn't raise you to back down from what's right," she said firmly. "If the principal won't listen, we'll find someone who will." Neither of them realized then how quickly their battle for simple fairness would escalate, nor how dramatically Isaiah King would eventually enter the picture, changing everything in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Friday night basketball games at Westridge High were usually the highlight of Jallen's week, a temporary escape from the constant vigilance required to navigate his daily life. The Tigers were playing their crosstown rivals, the atmosphere electric with teenage enthusiasm and competitive spirit. Jallen and Devon had arrived early to secure good seats, their faces painted in the school colors of blue and gold, temporarily free from the weight of their ongoing documentation project. The freedom was short-lived. During halftime, they headed to the concession stand, joining the crowd of hungry spectators. Devon reached the counter first, pulling out his wallet to pay for their nachos and sodas. That's when Officer Grayson appeared, seemingly materializing from nowhere. "Hold up," he said, grabbing Devon's arm roughly. "Someone reported a wallet stolen from the bleachers. Mind if I see what you've got there?" Devon froze, his expression shifting from confusion to the practiced neutrality that black teenagers learn is their safest response to law enforcement. "This is my wallet, sir. I've had it since my birthday last year." Jallen, witnessing the interaction, instinctively reached for his phone and began recording. Other students around them grew quiet, the festive atmosphere evaporating as Grayson continued his baseless accusation. "That's convenient," Grayson replied, his tone dripping with skepticism. "But I'm going to need to see some ID to verify it belongs to you." Devon carefully extracted his student ID from the wallet. Movements, deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Here you go, officer. And I can show you pictures in my phone of me with this same wallet if you need more proof." Grayson ignored the offered evidence, instead noticing Jallen recording the interaction. His face darkened. "And what do you think you're doing, King?" he demanded, taking a menacing step toward Jallen. "Recording a public interaction with a police officer, which is my constitutional right," Jallen replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "My father taught me to document everything." Grayson's hand shot out, snatching the phone from Jallen's grip. "Your father taught you, huh? And what would Daddy know about constitutional rights?" Jallen stood his ground, even as students around them began backing away. "My father is Commander Isaiah King, United States Army Special Forces. He knows plenty about the rights he's sworn to protect." The gymnasium fell silent enough to hear the squeak of basketball shoes on the court, where practice shots continued, oblivious to the confrontation. Grayson's laugh echoed against the cinder-block walls, cruel and dismissive. "Special Forces, right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense." He turned the phone in his hand, deliberately dropping it to the hard floor where the screen shattered. "Oops. Looks like you'll need a new phone to make up stories with." Devon stepped forward, anger overriding caution. "That was unnecessary, sir. We haven't done anything wrong." Grayson's response was immediate. He shoved Devon backward, causing him to stumble into a group of startled onlookers. "Back up before I decide you're creating a public disturbance." Jallen moved to help his friend, but Grayson intercepted him, twisting his arm painfully behind his back. "You think you're special because your daddy supposedly jumps out of planes. Let me tell you something, son. I've dealt with hundreds of you punks who think the rules don't apply to them. You're nothing special." Other students had begun recording now, phones raised as Grayson called for backup on his radio, claiming a disturbance requiring additional officers. When Jallen attempted to explain that they'd done nothing illegal, Grayson twisted his arm, harder. "That attitude is exactly why you people can't stay out of trouble," he growled, the racial subtext unmistakable. "Maybe a night in a cell will teach you some respect." By the time 2 additional officers arrived, Grayson had already handcuffed Jallen, ignoring the protests of students who had witnessed the entire unprovoked escalation. Coach Marcus Thompson pushed through the gathered crowd, demanding to know what was happening to one of his star students. "This doesn't concern you, Coach," Grayson said, dismissing the respected faculty member. "This young man was interfering with police business, and resisting lawful commands. Coach Thompson looked incredulously at Jallen's restrained form. "This is one of my best students. Whatever happened here, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." But Grayson was already marching Jallen toward the exit, ignoring both the coach's concerns and the requirement to notify parents before detaining a minor. "Special forces," he muttered mockingly as they passed through the doors. "I've heard some creative excuses in my time, but that takes the cake." Devon ran after them, frantically dialing Tanya King's number. "Mrs. King, they're arresting Jallen. Officer Grayson is taking him to the station." The last thing Jallen saw before being forced into the patrol car was Devon's desperate face and dozens of camera phones recording what would soon become viral evidence of Officer Grayson's abuse of power. As the car pulled away from the school, Jallen fought against the panic rising in his chest, focusing instead on what his father would do in this situation. Stay calm, observe everything, remember details, and most importantly, survive until help arrives. What he couldn't possibly know was that halfway around the world, Commander Isaiah King was already being extracted from a classified mission, alerted by a chain of emergency protocols that his family was in crisis. The confrontation at a high school basketball game was about to escalate far beyond anything Officer Richard Grayson could have anticipated. The Pinecrest Police Station smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly pallor over Jallen's dark skin as Officer Grayson paraded him through the bullpen like a trophy. "Got a disorderly conduct and resisting arrest from the high school game," Grayson announced to his colleagues, embellishing the non-existent charges with practiced ease. Several officers barely looked up from their paperwork, accustomed to Grayson's frequent detainments of minority youth for questionable offenses. A heavy-set officer with a salt-and-pepper mustache chuckled. "Basketball game. Let me guess which team he was supporting." The casual racism hung in the air, unchallenged except for a brief glance of discomfort from the desk sergeant, a Hispanic officer named Alvarez, who quickly returned his attention to his computer screen. Jallen was fingerprinted and photographed, each indignity burning into his memory as he maintained the dignified silence his father had taught him. "Nothing to say now, tough guy?" Grayson taunted, deliberately tightening the handcuffs until they bit into Jallen's wrists. "What happened to all that talk about your special forces, Daddy?" When Jallen remained silent, Grayson grew more agitated. "Not so brave without an audience, are you?" He shoved Jallen toward a holding cell where two other young men of color sat on metal benches, their expressions a mixture of resignation and simmering anger. Before locking the cell, Grayson leaned close, his voice low and menacing. "Your kind never learns. This is my town, and the sooner you figure that out, the easier your life will be." The cell door clanged shut with finality, but Jallen refused to give Grayson the satisfaction of seeing his fear. Instead, he sat perfectly straight, eyes forward, embodying the military bearing he'd observed in his father during the rare occasions Isaiah had been home. In the general office area, Tanya King arrived like a controlled storm, her voice carrying through the station with the precision of someone intimately familiar with bureaucratic stonewalling. "My son is 16 years old. You have no right to question him without my presence or that of an attorney." Chief Bradley Lowell emerged from his office, his imposing frame and practiced authoritative demeanor designed to intimidate civilians. "Mrs. King, I presume. I understand you're upset, but your son was involved in a serious incident at the school. Officer Grayson was responding to a potential theft, and your son interfered with police business." Tanya's expression didn't waver. "My son was recording a public interaction, which is his constitutional right. His phone was destroyed by your officer, and he was detained without cause. I want to see him immediately, and I want all charges dropped." As they argued, Sergeant Alvarez quietly approached her during a moment when the chief was distracted. "Check your phone," he murmured before walking away. Tanya found a text message from an unknown number. "Multiple witness videos online. Search Westridge High Police. Document everything." The message confirmed what she already suspected. Grayson had overstepped badly, and there was evidence. What she couldn't know was that Alvarez had been quietly building a file on Grayson's misconduct for months, looking for a case strong enough to break through the department's code of silence. Meanwhile, Chief Lowell was explaining why the charges wouldn't be dropped. Your son displayed a pattern of disrespect for authority and made false claims about his father's military status to intimidate an officer. We take impersonation of military personnel very seriously. Tanya's laugh was short and without humor. My husband is Commander Isaiah King, 5th Special Forces Group. Would you like his commanding officer's contact information? I'm sure the Pentagon would be fascinated to hear you're detaining his son on fabricated charges. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lowell's face, quickly masked by practiced authority. We'll certainly verify that information. In the meantime, your son will remain in custody until processing is complete. What neither of them knew was that verification was already underway through channels far above the Pinecrest Police Department's pay grade. Isaiah King's security clearance and position had triggered automated alerts when his name appeared in connection with a law enforcement incident. While Tanya fought the system from the lobby, outside the station, a small crowd had begun to gather. Devon had mobilized their classmates through social media, and the videos of Jallen's unjust detention were spreading rapidly, drawing community members concerned about the latest example of apparent racial profiling by the department. Local news vans appeared, sensing a developing story with potent visuals and community impact. Inside the holding cell, Jallen made careful mental notes of everything. The other detainees' stories, similar to his own, minor or non-existent infractions escalated by prejudiced officers, the time of each shift change, which officers seemed uncomfortable with the situation versus those who were complicit. One of his cellmates, a 20-year-old named Marcus, who'd been detained for suspicious behavior while waiting for a bus, leaned over to whisper, "They're banking on us not knowing our rights or having resources to fight back. My cousin got caught in this same trap last month, ended up with a record for nothing." Before Jallen could respond, the station's atmosphere suddenly shifted. A commotion at the front desk drew everyone's attention as raised voices carried through the building. Sergeant Alvarez appeared at the cell, his expression carefully neutral, but his actions rushed as he unlocked the door. "King, come with me. Chief wants to see you." As Jallen was led through the bullpen, he noticed officers frantically straightening, uniforms and clearing desks of coffee cups. Something had changed. In the chief's office, Tanya stood with barely contained fury beside an uncomfortable-looking Lowell. "Jallen, are you hurt?" she asked immediately, examining the marks on his wrists from the two tight handcuffs. "I'm okay, Mom," he assured her, though the psychological weight of the past few hours pressed heavily on him. Chief Lowell cleared his throat. "It seems there may have been a misunderstanding regarding your detention, Mr. King. After reviewing the circumstances, we'll be releasing you without charges." The abrupt reversal raised Jallen's suspicions. "What about Devon? Has anyone checked if he's okay after Officer Grayson assaulted him too?" Lowell's tight smile never reached his eyes. "We're investigating all aspects of tonight's incident. You're free to go now." As they left the office, Jallen noticed Officer Grayson standing rigidly by the far wall, his face flushed with anger but remaining uncharacteristically silent. Something significant had happened, but what? The answer came as they exited the station to find the gathering crowd parting for a black SUV with government plates that had just arrived. The vehicle's door opened, and Commander Isaiah King emerged, still wearing desert fatigues with sand from another continent embedded in their creases. His eyes, hard as flint from years of combat and command, found his son immediately. The journey from battlefield to hometown had taken 16 hours of emergency flights, calls to the highest levels of military command, and the cashing in of political capital Isaiah had accumulated over decades of distinguished service. But seeing the marks on his son's wrists and the poorly concealed fear in his eyes, Isaiah knew he would have moved heaven and earth to get here faster if possible. Have you ever been in a situation where authority figures abused their power? Comment number 1 if you believe Officer Grayson should be held accountable for his actions, or number 2 if you think he was just doing his job. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're invested in seeing justice for Jallen. What do you think will happen now that Commander King has arrived? Will the police department face consequences, or will they find a way to cover up their wrongdoing? Subscribe to find out as this intense story continues. The King family home became command central for what was rapidly evolving into a community movement against police misconduct in Pinecrest. The modest four-bedroom colonial with its meticulously maintained lawn had always been Tanya's domain during Isaiah's long deployments, but now the dining room table was covered with legal documents, witness statements, and the business cards of journalists, civil rights attorneys, and community organizers who had rallied to their cause in the 72 hours since Jallen's detention. Sergeant Miguel Alvarez had taken the most significant risk, meeting Isaiah in a coffee shop 2 towns over to deliver a flash drive containing years of internal communications documenting the department's disproportionate targeting of minority residents. "I joined the force to protect people, not terrorize them," Alvarez explained, his voice low despite the careful precautions they'd taken to avoid surveillance. "Grayson's been untouchable because Chief Lowell sees him as a necessary enforcer of the department's unwritten policies. They call it proactive policing, but it's just profiling with a fancy name." Isaiah's military training had taught him to recognize valuable intelligence assets, and he treated Alvarez with the respect such allies deserved. "What made you decide to help us specifically?" Alvarez's eyes drifted to a family photo on Isaiah's phone. "I have a son Jallen's age. When I saw how Grayson treated him, knowing your boy had done nothing wrong, I couldn't look my son in the eye if I stayed silent." This hidden network of support extended further than the Kings initially realized. Devon had transformed from Jallen's best friend to his most effective advocate, organizing fellow students to document their experiences with Officer Grayson and other instances of discrimination at Westridge High. Using a secure messaging app, they collected over 40 detailed accounts of racial profiling incidents, building a pattern of evidence that would be difficult to dismiss as isolated misunderstandings. Attorney Sharon Blake, a Harvard-educated lawyer with the Southern Justice Coalition, arrived at the King residence with 2 paralegals and a digital forensics expert. Her reputation for dismantling discriminatory systems through meticulous legal strategy had earned her both admiration from civil rights advocates and wariness from police departments throughout the South. "What happened to your son isn't just a violation of his civil rights," she explained to the family. "It's part of a pattern that we can prove has been ongoing for years. The videos from the basketball game are just the visible tip of a very ugly iceberg." As Blake outlined potential legal strategies, Isaiah received a call from Colonel James Westbrook, his former commanding officer and mentor from his early days in Special Forces. "I've made some inquiries about this Pinecrest situation," Westbrook said without preamble. "Your name being involved raised flags in places that don't typically concern themselves with small-town police matters. How do you want to play this, Isaiah?" The fact that Westbrook was calling on an unsecured line told Isaiah everything he needed to know about the level of official interest his case had generated. "By the book, sir, but the complete book, not the redacted version they're used to. Showing the public." Westbrook's understanding was immediate. "I'll make sure you have what you need. The secretary sends his regards." While Isaiah navigated the military and federal connections that could bring additional pressure to bear, Tanya accessed her own network of influence through her position as an adjunct professor at the state university. Academic colleagues with expertise in criminal justice reform, statistical analysis of discriminatory practices, and media communications offered their services, transforming the King family's personal injustice into a textbook case study of how to challenge systemic racism. Throughout this flurry of strategic activity, Jallen found himself processing not just the trauma of his detention, but also the revelation of his father's true influence. Growing up, he had understood his father's military role in abstract terms. Isaiah was often absent, his work was classified, and his rare stories from deployments were heavily edited for security and age appropriateness. Now witnessing Isaiah activate networks that spanned from Pentagon officials to undercover operatives who mysteriously appeared with crucial information, Jallen began to understand why Officer Grayson's mockery of his father's status had felt so particularly unjust. One evening, finding Jallen alone on the back deck staring at the stars, Isaiah joined his son in the comfortable silence they'd always been able to share despite their limited time together. "You never told me," Jallen finally said. "About what?" You really do. About who you really are. Isaiah's smile held both pride and regret. Some things are classified for good reasons, but others, I think I kept them from you because I wanted you to have your own identity, not live in my shadow. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. The men and women I've served with, many who look like us, have sacrificed everything to protect American ideals that they themselves are often denied in their own hometowns. That contradiction has always been the hardest part of the job. The personal conversation was interrupted by Tanya calling them inside for an emergency meeting. Devon had arrived breathless with news that a social media campaign highlighting Jallen's case had gone viral with the hashtag #ChanceJusticeForJallen trending nationally. More significantly, an anonymous source had leaked Officer Grayson's personnel file to several news outlets, revealing 7 previous complaints of excessive force against minority individuals, all of which had been dismissed without serious investigation. The King's dining room strategy session continued late into the night, mapping connections between the growing number of allies offering support from increasingly influential positions. What no one at the table fully appreciated yet was how the intersection of Isaiah's military connections, Tanya's academic network, and Jallen's generation's facility with digital organizing had created a perfect storm that the entrenched power, the structure of Pinecrest, was ill-equipped to weather. In the police department, this reality was beginning to dawn on Chief Lowell as he called an emergency meeting of his senior officers. "This has escalated beyond a local matter," he informed. Them, his typical confidence notably diminished. "I've received calls from the mayor, the governor's office, and 2 federal agencies asking for detailed reports on our departmental practices." Officer Grayson, still believing himself protected by the system that had always shielded him, scoffed at the concern. "Since when do we answer to social media mobs? This will blow over like everything else." Sergeant Alvarez, carefully maintaining his cover as a reluctant but obedient officer, watched Grayson's dismissive attitude with internal satisfaction. The accountability that had long been denied to Pinecrest's minority residents was approaching, like an unstoppable tide, and Grayson's inability to recognize it would only make his eventual reckoning more complete. As dawn broke over the King household, Isaiah received the call he'd been anticipating from his current commanding officer. "Commander King, your emergency leave has been extended indefinitely. The situation involving your son has been classified as a matter of national security interest due to your position and clearance level." What remained unspoken but understood was the message behind these unusual orders. Isaiah had the full backing of his chain of command to pursue justice for his son through all available channels. The small-town police department that had casually dismissed Jallen's reference to his father's special forces status was about to discover exactly what it meant to have Commander Isaiah King focused on their operations with the precision and determination that had made him a legend in military circles. The hidden allies who had emerged to support the King family's fight were merely the advance guard of a much larger force for change that was assembling, invisible to those who had long benefited from the status quo, but increasingly evident to those who had suffered under it. Chief Bradley Lowell's press conference on the steps of the Pinecrest Police Department headquarters was meant to project confidence and control, but the beads of sweat forming at his temples betrayed the pressure he was feeling as cameras from not just local but national news outlets trained on his face. "The Pinecrest Police Department has always maintained the highest standards of professional conduct," he declared, reading from a prepared statement that had gone through multiple revisions by the department's increasingly nervous legal team. "The incident involving student Jallen King at Westridge High School is being thoroughly investigated according to established protocols. Officer Richard Grayson has been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of this investigation, which we expect to be completed promptly and transparently." The assembled reporters were uncharacteristically aggressive in their follow-up questions, armed with information that had been strategically leaked by the King family's growing network of supporters. "Chief Lowell, how do you respond to records showing that Officer Grayson has had 7 previous complaints of excessive force against minority residents, none of which resulted in disciplinary action?" called out a CNN correspondent who had arrived that morning. Before Lowell could formulate a response, a local reporter followed up. Sources within your department claim that Officers Rodriguez and Chen were reprimanded last year for reporting Grayson's misconduct. Can you confirm or deny this allegation? The chief's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time, broadcast live across multiple platforms. Meanwhile, across town, Jallen King was experiencing unexpected backlash at Pinecrest Community College, where she taught sociology courses. Dean Walter Harrington had called her into his office, his discomfort evident as he closed the door for privacy. "Tanya, I've always respected your work here," he began, straightening papers on his desk that didn't need organizing. "But the attention your family's situation is bringing to the college is concerning to some board members. Perhaps a leave of absence would be appropriate until things settle down." Tanya's response was measured but firm. "Are you suggesting that my son's civil rights being violated is an inconvenience to the college's image, Walter?" The dean flushed. "Of course not. It's just that donations and enrollment are sensitive to controversy, and some of our more conservative supporters have expressed concern about the college appearing to take a political position by association. With your family's case," Tanya stood gathering her materials with deliberate calm, "my family isn't a political position, Walter. We're American citizens asserting our constitutional rights. If the college can't distinguish between politics and basic human dignity, perhaps I should consider more than just a temporary leave." The threat of losing one of their most published faculty members, particularly one with growing national media attention, was not lost on the dean, who quickly backpedaled. "No one's asking you to leave, Tanya. Let me talk to the board again. I'm sure we can find a reasonable accommodation." As she left the administrative building, Tanya found her car's windshield plastered with printed papers bearing racial slurs and the message, "Blue Lives Matter," in bold text. She photographed the vandalism before removing it, adding another piece of evidence to the growing documentation of intimidation tactics being employed against her family. At the juvenile detention center, where Jallen had narrowly avoided being transferred on the night of his arrest, another drama was unfolding. Marcus Johnson, the young man who had shared Jallen's holding cell, was facing a hearing to determine whether he would be released or held on the dubious, suspicious behavior charges Officer Grayson had filed. Attorney Sharon Blake had expanded her representation to include Marcus after learning of his situation, recognizing the strategic value of demonstrating a pattern of similar cases. "Your Honor," Blake addressed Judge Howard Whitman, husband of Westridge High's Principal Eleanor Whitman, a connection she intended to highlight, "the state has presented no evidence that Mr. Johnson committed any crime whatsoever. He was waiting for a bus at a public bus stop at 4 in the afternoon. The arresting officers claim that this constituted suspicious behavior is transparently discriminatory." Judge Whitman, already uncomfortable with the unusual level of scrutiny this routine hearing was receiving due to Blake's involvement and the two national newspaper reporters sitting in the gallery, reluctantly ordered Marcus's immediate release and the dismissal of all charges. This small victory reverberated through the community of color in Pinecrest, where such outcomes were virtually unheard of, reinforcing the growing sense that the system's grip was finally loosening. Commander Isaiah King, meanwhile, was navigating a delicate balance between his military responsibilities and his family's fight for justice. A video call with his commanding general had made the stakes exceedingly clear. "Isaiah, you know I support you personally in this," General Reynolds said, his expression grave, "but there are concerns at higher levels about a special forces commander being publicly identified in connection with a civilian police matter. Our operations require anonymity for good reasons." Isaiah understood the subtext immediately. "I've maintained operational security, sir. No classified information has been or will be compromised." The general nodded. "See that it stays that way. There are elements within the Pentagon who believe your involvement could jeopardize ongoing missions. They're pushing for your reassignment to a desk position until this is resolved." The threat of being sidelined from field operations after 15 years of distinguished service was significant, but Isaiah's priority remained clear. "Understood, sir. I appreciate the warning." After the call ended, Isaiah received an encrypted message from a former teammate, now working in federal law enforcement. Pinecrest PD servers being mirrored by FBI Civil Rights Division, evidence preservation underway. Unofficial intel only. This confirmation that federal authorities were quietly gathering evidence reinforced Isaiah's strategy of applying pressure through multiple channels simultaneously. Officer Grayson, seemingly oblivious to the closing net, had begun his own campaign of intimidation. Devon Marshall, whose video evidence had been crucial in documenting Jallen's unlawful detention, found himself pulled over 3 times in 2 days by patrol officers who claimed routine traffic enforcement, but asked pointed questions about his friendship with Jallen and his extracurricular activities. When Devon reported these incidents to Sergeant Alvarez, the officer advised him to install a dashboard camera and provided a direct line to call if he felt threatened. "Document everything," Alvarez instructed, the same advice he had given Tanya days earlier. "And never drive alone if you can help it." The sergeant's dual role as both a police insider and a key informant for the King family was becoming increasingly precarious as departmental leadership grew suspicious of information leaks. Chief Lowell had ordered an internal investigation focusing on communications security, installing monitoring software on department computers, and requiring officers to surrender personal phones during shifts. Alvarez had adapted quickly, using burner phones and dead-drop information exchanges that utilized his military experience from before joining the police force. "They're getting desperate," he told Isaiah during their latest clandestine meeting in the parking garage of a neighboring town's shopping mall. Lowell's ordered the IT department to schedule system maintenance that will accidentally erase 3 months of body camera footage and dispatch records. "It's happening tomorrow night." Isaiah passed this information to Attorney Blake, who immediately filed an emergency motion for a preservation order covering all departmental records. Judge Melissa Carter, a federal judge with no connections to Pinecrest's power structure, granted the motion and appointed a special master to oversee compliance, effectively blocking the department's attempt to destroy evidence. The interconnected pressures from legal, media, community, and now federal sources were creating fissures in what had previously been a unified front of institutional protection for discriminatory practices. Officers with no history of misconduct began quietly distancing themselves from Grayson and others known for targeting minority residents. Anonymous tips about additional incidents began reaching Sergeant Alvarez, who carefully channeled them to the appropriate legal and media contacts. Each day brought new revelations and escalations, but also new risks. The King's home security system recorded multiple unmarked vehicles conducting surveillance from across the street. Tanya's email account was hacked, with personal messages appearing on a police-supporting social media page. Jallen received threatening messages from anonymous accounts warning him to back off or else. Rather than intimidating them, these tactics only strengthened the family's resolve and provided additional evidence of a coordinated attempt to obstruct justice. As the pressure continued mounting from multiple directions, Isaiah received word that his request to access certain classified resources had been approved at the highest levels. What Officer Grayson and Chief Lowell could not know was that their department's activities had intersected with a matter of national security that predated Jallen's detention, placing them unwittingly in the crosshairs of interests far more powerful than a single Special Forces commander seeking justice for his son. The true nature of Isaiah King's military role and its connection to Pinecrest would soon emerge, dramatically raising the stakes for everyone involved. The fluorescent lights of the Pinecrest Police Department's booking area cast harsh shadows across Jallen's face as he watched, disbelieving, while Officer Grayson processed transfer paperwork that would send him to the county juvenile detention center despite the absence of formal charges. "This is illegal," Jallen stated firmly, channeling the composure he'd seen his father maintain in crisis situations. "You can't transfer a minor without guardian notification or charges being filed." Grayson barely looked up from his paperwork, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Actually, I can hold you for 72 hours while investigating potential charges. Maybe you should have paid more attention in civics class instead of making up stories about your daddy." The deliberate provocation tested Jallen's self-control, but he remembered his father's advice: never give them the reaction they're seeking. This unexpected second detention had occurred when Jallen was walking home from a strategy meeting with Devon and other student activists. A patrol car had pulled alongside him, and Officer Grayson had emerged, claiming he'd received reports of someone matching Jallen's description acting suspiciously in the neighborhood. Despite Jallen's calm assertion of his rights and attempt to call his mother, he found himself handcuffed and back in the station where his ordeal had begun. What Grayson didn't know was that Jallen had activated the emergency recording app Sergeant Alvarez had helped install on his new phone, which was streaming audio directly to a secure server while simultaneously alerting his parents and attorney, Blake, to his location. Across town, Tanya King returned home from her evening class to find her car's tires slashed and a crude racial slur spray-painted across her garage door. The escalation from paper threats to property damage marked a dangerous new phase in the intimidation campaign against the family. As she documented the vandalism for the case file, her phone buzzed with the emergency alert from Jallen's app. The dual crises momentarily overwhelmed her, until military spouse training kicked in. Prioritize, act decisively, emotions later. She called Isaiah, who was meeting with federal investigators in Washington, D.C., then Attorney Blake, who immediately filed for an emergency hearing with the on-call judge to prevent Jallen's transfer to juvenile detention. At the police station, Chief Lowell observed Grayson's processing of Jallen with growing unease. The department's legal counsel had warned him repeatedly about the risks of further actions against the King family, given the mounting scrutiny, but Grayson had proceeded without authorization, placing Lowell in an impossible position. Supporting. Grayson's actions would further implicate the department in a pattern of harassment. Disavowing them would fracture the thin blue line code that had protected their operations for years. His indecision proved costly, as Attorney Blake arrived with a court order signed by Federal Judge Carter, demanding Jallen's immediate release and barring any officer from the Pinecrest Police Department from approaching within 100 yards of any member of the King family without explicit judicial approval. The document bore the weight of federal authority that superseded Lowell's local power, leaving him no choice but to comply while the watching officers absorbed the unprecedented check on their previously unchallenged authority. As Jallen walked, free for the second time, the gathering crowd outside the station had grown to include not just local supporters, but representatives from national civil rights organizations who had been drawn to Pinecrest by the increasingly high-profile case. Among them was Congressman James Lewis, himself a former victim of police misconduct during his youth, who had come to lend his personal support to the King family and the weight of his office to their cause. What we're witnessing in Pinecrest, he told the assembled media, is not just about one boy or one officer. It's about whether we truly believe in equal protection under the law for all Americans, regardless of their color or background. The confluence of continued police misconduct, high-profile political attention, and the documentation of escalating intimidation tactics created a perfect storm of media coverage that thrust Pinecrest into the national spotlight. Chief Lowell's attempt to regain narrative control through another press conference backfired spectacularly when a reporter questioned him about department communications planning the deliberate targeting of King family allies. The documents had been leaked by Sergeant Alvarez through channels so carefully obscured that the chief mistakenly blamed a civilian administrative assistant, firing her publicly only to have her attorney produce evidence of her innocence, adding wrongful termination to the department's growing legal vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Isaiah King's meetings in Washington had yielded unexpected connections between Pinecrest's police department and a matter of national security he had been investigating in his professional capacity. 3 years earlier, his specialized counterterrorism unit had tracked financial support for domestic extremist groups to a shell corporation with ties to several small-town police departments, including Pinecrest. The investigation had been shelved due to jurisdictional complications, but Isaiah's personal involvement in the current civil rights case had reopened those channels, leading to the discovery that Officer Grayson and 2 other Pinecrest officers had attended training sessions run by a private security company, flagged for extremist connections. This information transformed what had begun as a personal fight for justice into a matter potentially involving domestic terrorism, elevating the case to the highest priority levels of federal law enforcement. As Isaiah flew back to Pinecrest, with this explosive new information, Sergeant Alvarez found himself under increasing scrutiny within the department. An internal affairs investigator had begun questioning his colleagues about his movements and communications, particularly his absences during meetings with the King family. Recognizing that his cover might soon be compromised, Alvarez accelerated his evidence collection, downloading encryption-protected departmental files that documented years of systematic civil rights violations before removing his personal items from his locker in preparation for the inevitable confrontation. The breaking point came when Officer Grayson, increasingly unstable under the pressure of public scrutiny and internal investigation, confronted Sergeant Alvarez in the department parking lot after shift change. "I know you're the leak," he snarled, backing the smaller officer against his car. "You've been feeding information to those people." Alvarez maintained his composure despite the physical intimidation. "I don't know what you're talking about, Grayson. Back off before you do something you'll regret." The escalation might have turned violent if not for the timely arrival of several officers from the night shift, whose presence forced Grayson to retreat with a parting threat. "This isn't over, traitor." That night, Alvarez made the decision he had been contemplating for weeks. Using secure channels established with federal authorities, he formally became a whistleblower, providing sworn testimony about the department's practices in exchange for protection for himself and his family. His detailed insider account of how racial profiling had been systematically encouraged and protected by departmental leadership provided the final piece of evidence needed for the Justice Department to announce a pattern or practice investigation into the entire Pinecrest Police Department. As dawn broke on what would become the most consequential day in Pinecrest's recent history, multiple federal agencies coordinated simultaneous operations. FBI agents secured the police department's servers and records before they could be destroyed. IRS investigators arrived at Chief Lowell's home with questions about unexplained deposits to offshore accounts, and Isaiah King, having been officially attached to the federal task force due to his unique knowledge of both the civil rights case and its national security implications, prepared to confront the man who had mocked his son and dismissed his service to the country. The breaking point had been reached, transforming a local injustice into a national reckoning. Do you believe the system eventually corrects itself, or does it take extraordinary circumstances like the King family's connections to achieve justice? Comment number 1 if you think most victims of police misconduct never get the justice they deserve, or number 2 if you believe the system generally works if people know their rights. Hit that like button if you're cheering for Sergeant Alvarez's brave decision to become a whistleblower. What do you think will happen when Commander King finally confronts Officer Grayson face to face? Will justice be served, or will the broken system find another way to protect its own? Subscribe now to see how this powerful confrontation unfolds in our next part. The Pinecrest Police Department headquarters had transformed overnight from a symbol of unquestioned local authority to the epicenter of a federal investigation, with FBI agents in windbreakers methodically boxing evidence and interviewing visibly uncomfortable officers in glass-walled conference rooms. Officer Richard Grayson sat alone in the break room, his usual supporters having strategically distanced themselves as the magnitude of the investigation became clear. He scrolled through messages on his phone, ignoring the department-wide directive not to delete any communications when the room's atmosphere suddenly shifted. Conversations ceased, coffee cups froze mid-air, and all eyes turned toward the entrance where Commander Isaiah King stood in his full-dress uniform, the weight of his combat decorations and Special Forces insignia creating an unmistakable presence that commanded immediate respect. Behind him stood 2 military police officers and a Justice Department official, their formal posture indicating this was no casual visit. Chief Lowell emerged from his office, attempting to project authority despite the federal agents currently imaging his computer's hard drive. "Commander King," he acknowledged with forced cordiality. "This is an unexpected honor. How can the Pinecrest Police Department assist you today?" Isaiah's response was measured, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "I'm here as part of the federal task force investigating civil rights violations and potential connections to matters of national security. Officer Richard Grayson needs to answer some questions regarding both his treatment of my son and his associations with certain organizations of interest to counter-terrorism units. The public identification of Grayson in connection with terrorism investigations sent a visible shock through the assembled officers. Grayson himself stood abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "This is harassment. You can't come in here throwing around accusations just because your delinquent son couldn't follow simple instructions." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Isaiah turned his full attention to Grayson for the first time. "Officer Grayson, you detained my 16-year-old son without cause, physically assaulted him, destroyed his property, mocked his truthful statements about my military service, and attempted to transfer him to juvenile detention without charges or parental notification. Each of these actions violated department policy, state law, and constitutional protections. Your subsequent harassment of my family and their supporters has been documented extensively." He stepped closer, his voice lowering to ensure his next words weren't captured by the room's ambient recording devices. "But what you couldn't have known is that your name had already appeared in classified intelligence reports long before you ever encountered my son. Your participation in training programs run by the Patriot Defense Initiative flagged you in a counter-terrorism database 2 years ago. My team has been tracking financial connections between that organization and domestic extremist groups operating across state lines, which makes this a federal matter regardless of your department's attempts to circle the wagons." The color drained from Grayson's face as he realized the depth of the investigation he faced and the impossibility of local protection extending to federal terrorism charges. Chief Lowell, sensing his department's rapidly deteriorating position, attempted damage control. "Commander King, surely we can discuss these matters in private. There's no need to disrupt department operations with these allegations." The Justice Department official accompanying Isaiah stepped forward, presenting Lowell with a thick document. "This is a federal warrant authorizing the seizure of all departmental records, personal communications devices of specified officers, and financial documentation dating back 5 years. Your department operations are officially suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." What followed was a choreographed demonstration of federal authority systematically dismantling local power structures that had operated with impunity for generations. Officers were separated for individual interviews, passwords to secured systems were required under subpoena, and Grayson himself was escorted to a private room for formal questioning about both his treatment of Jallen and his connections to extremist organizations. As the process unfolded, Jallen and Tanya arrived at the station accompanied by Attorney Blake and Congressman Lewis, their presence ensuring transparent proceedings and signaling to the community that substantive action was finally occurring after years of unanswered complaints. Outside, a growing crowd of community members gathered, many holding signs supporting Jallen or bearing the names of others who had experienced similar treatment from the department. The mood was not celebratory, but watchful, a community holding its collective breath to see if justice, so long denied, might finally be possible. Inside a secured conference room, Isaiah was finally able to embrace his son properly for the first time since his emergency return. The disciplined commander who had coordinated complex military operations across multiple continents allowed himself a moment of vulnerability as he held Jallen close. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have been here." Jallen pulled back slightly, meeting his father's eyes with newfound understanding. "You're here now, and I think I finally understand what you've been fighting for all these years." Their private moment was interrupted by a Justice Department official requesting Isaiah's presence for a briefing on evidence that had already been uncovered. Before leaving, Isaiah placed his hands on Jallen's shoulders, pride evident in his expression. What you did, standing up for yourself and others, documenting everything, knowing your rights, that took more courage than most of my military operations. Never doubt that. The power dynamic shift extended beyond the police department to reach the broader power structures of Pinecrest. Principal Whitman, who had dismissed Jallen's initial complaints about Officer Grayson, found herself explaining to federal investigators why she had failed to report multiple instances of potentially discriminatory treatment of minority students. Judge Howard Whitman, whose court had routinely rubber-stamped police detention requests for young men of color, was notified of a judicial conduct investigation into pattern and practice concerns. Even Mayor Robert Patterson, who had initially defended the police department unconditionally, issued a carefully worded statement about the city's commitment to constitutional policing and equal protection under the law, distancing himself from the growing scandal. By evening, the initial phase of the federal intervention was complete. Officer Grayson and 2 other officers with documented extremist connections were suspended pending further investigation. Chief Lowell was placed on administrative leave after financial irregularities were discovered in department funding allocations, and most significantly for the community, Sergeant Miguel Alvarez was formally recognized as a protected federal whistleblower. His years of carefully documenting departmental misconduct now forming the backbone of what would likely become one of the most comprehensive civil rights investigations in the state's history. As the King family returned home that evening, escorted by federal agents assigned to ensure their safety during the ongoing investigation, the neighbors who had previously kept their distance emerged from their homes to line the street in a show of solidarity. Some held candles, others simply stood in silent support, but the message was clear. The community recognized the King's courage in challenging a system that had seemed untouchable. Inside their home, as the adrenaline of the day finally subsided, Isaiah, Tanya, and Jallen sat together in their living room, processing the monumental shifts that had occurred. "What happens now?" Jallen asked, the weight of becoming the catalyst for such sweeping changes evident in his voice. Isaiah exchanged a glance with Tanya before answering. "Now comes the harder part. Dismantling corrupt systems is just the first step. Building something better in their place, that's the real challenge." What none of them could have anticipated was how Isaiah's perspective, shaped by years of defending American ideals abroad while witnessing their imperfect implementation at home, would become central to Pinecrest's painful but necessary transformation in the months ahead. Nor could they have foreseen how Jallen's experience would ripple outward, inspiring similar reckonings in communities across the country where the shield of qualified immunity and departmental secrecy had long protected discriminatory practices from meaningful scrutiny and reform. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of Pinecrest City Hall auditorium, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air above the assembled crowd. Every seat was filled for the public hearing that would determine the future of the city's police department, with community members standing 3 deep along the walls, and news cameras positioned strategically to capture what had become a nationally significant story about racial justice, institutional accountability, and the power of a single family's stand against systemic discrimination. State Attorney General Eliza Washington had personally taken charge of the proceedings, flanked by representatives from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The gravity of their presence was not lost on the city council members seated uncomfortably on the dais, their usual positions of local authority diminished by the federal and state oversight that had descended on Pinecrest with hurricane force. This hearing will establish the factual record regarding patterns and practices within the Pinecrest Police Department, Attorney General Washington began, her authoritative voice requiring no microphone despite the room's size. We will hear testimony from community members, department personnel, and expert witnesses before determining appropriate remedial actions. I remind everyone that these proceedings are being conducted under oath, with potential criminal penalties for false statements. The first witnesses established the historical context for the current crisis. Longtime Black and Latino residents who recounted decades of disparate treatment, their previously ignored complaints now receiving the formal acknowledgement of being entered into an official record. An elderly man named Joseph Turner described how his grandsons were routinely stopped while driving through certain neighborhoods, a pattern unchanged since he had experienced the same treatment in the 1960s. Professor Amara Wilson from the State University presented statistical analysis demonstrating that black residents were 6 times more likely than white residents to be detained by Pinecrest police, with Latino residents facing 4 times the detention rate, disparities that couldn't be explained by any demographic or crime pattern variables. As morning gave way to afternoon, the testimony shifted to current and former police department employees. Several officers, granted immunity for their truthful testimony, described the informal quota systems for citations and arrests that disproportionately targeted minority neighborhoods. A former dispatcher explained how certain addresses received deliberately delayed response times based on racial demographics, with call records manipulated to obscure the pattern. But it was Sergeant Miguel Alvarez's testimony that riveted the room, his meticulous documentation of departmental misconduct, providing irrefutable evidence of systematic civil rights violations spanning years. I began keeping records after witnessing Officer Grayson detain 3 black teenagers for suspicious loitering when they were clearly waiting at a bus stop on their way to school, Alvarez explained, his testimony accompanied by time-stamped videos from his personal body camera that he had maintained against department policy. When I raised concerns to Chief Lowell, he instructed me to focus on real police work and removed me from patrol duties for 30 days. That's when I realized the issue wasn't individual officers, but an institutional culture that rewarded discriminatory practices while punishing those who questioned them. The afternoon session culminated with Officer Richard Grayson's reluctant appearance, compelled by subpoena and flanked by his attorney. His testimony alternated between defensive justifications and strategic memory lapses, his previously intimidating presence diminished by the formal setting and the weight of evidence arrayed against him. I was just enforcing the law as I understood it, he insisted when questioned about his treatment of Jallen King. If certain communities have more frequent interactions with police, perhaps they should examine their own behaviors rather than blaming officers doing their jobs. The statement drew audible gasps from the audience and visible disapproval from the Attorney General, setting the stage for the day's final and most anticipated witness. Commander Isaiah King approached the testimony table in full dress uniform, the room falling silent as he was sworn in. Rather than beginning with Jallen's case as expected, State Investigator Marcus Johnson took Isaiah's testimony in an unexpected direction. Commander King, before addressing the incident involving your son, I'd like to establish your professional background and expertise relevant to these proceedings. Could you briefly describe your military service and specializations? What followed was the first public disclosure of Isaiah King's full military record that security classifications would permit. 22 years of service, multiple combat deployments, specialized training in counter-terrorism, intelligence analysis and civil affairs operations, focusing on rebuilding governance structures in conflict zones, advanced degrees in international relations and constitutional law, awards for valor. That couldn't be fully described due to the classified nature of the operations involved. The portrait that emerged was of a deeply experienced professional whose expertise in both security operations and constitutional protections made him uniquely qualified to evaluate the Pinecrest Police Department's conduct. Commander King, based on your professional experience, how would you characterize the patterns of behavior documented in the Pinecrest Police Department? Investigator Johnson asked. Isaiah's response was measured but unequivocal. In my professional opinion, what we've observed represents a fundamental breakdown in constitutional policing. The patterns of selective enforcement, evidence manipulation, and targeted intimidation mirror tactics I've encountered in authoritarian regimes where police function as instruments of control rather than public servants. The key difference is that those regimes don't operate under a constitution that explicitly prohibits such practices. His testimony then shifted to the specific incident involving Jallen, providing a detailed timeline corroborated by witness statements, video evidence, and department records obtained through federal warrants. The clinical precision of his account somehow made the injustice more stark, stripping away any possibility of dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding or isolated occurrence. As his testimony approached its conclusion, Isaiah introduced the revelation that transformed the hearing from a local accountability process to a matter of national security concern. During my professional duties monitoring domestic extremism threats, I became aware of connections between certain private training organizations and police departments across multiple jurisdictions. One such organization, the Patriot Defense Initiative, conducted specialized training sessions attended by Officer Grayson and other Pinecrest officers, where they were exposed to interpretations of law enforcement authority that fundamentally contradict constitutional limitations. Isaiah paused, ensuring his next statement was clearly understood. These training programs explicitly encouraged officers to view certain communities as inherently suspicious, to use pretextual stops as intelligence-gathering opportunities without probable cause, and to maintain informal systems of control through selective enforcement and intimidation. What happened to my son wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment by a single officer. It was the predictable outcome of systematic indoctrination into unconstitutional policing philosophies with connections to classified domestic security threats. The implications rippled through the room as attendees realized they were witnessing not just a local police accountability hearing, but the public edge of a much larger national security investigation. Chief Lowell, seated in the back row awaiting his own testimony, visibly paled as he grasped the extent to which federal authorities had connected Pinecrest's policing problems to broader extremism concerns that transcended local jurisdiction or political influence. The day's final bombshell came during cross-examination, when Chief Lowell's attorney attempted to discredit Isaiah's testimony by suggesting personal bias. "Commander King, isn't it true that your involvement in this case is driven primarily by parental concern rather than professional assessment? Wouldn't any father react strongly to his son's detention, regardless of circumstances?" Isaiah's response silenced the room. "My professional assessment and parental concern align completely in this case, but there's another factor you should be aware of. Officer Grayson doesn't remember me, but we've met before." He turned to face Grayson directly for the first time. 6 years ago, your National Guard unit was deployed to assist with flood evacuation in eastern Tennessee. During that operation, you were part of a team trapped by rising waters while trying to reach a nursing home. My Special Forces unit was diverted from training exercises to extract you and the endangered civilians. I personally pulled you from that water, Staff Sergeant Grayson. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the silent room. The oath you took as a soldier and the oath you took as a police officer are fundamentally the same: to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When you detained my son without cause, mocked his truthful statements about my service, and attempted to criminalize him for exercising his constitutional rights, you didn't just fail him. You failed that oath. The personal connection between the two men recontextualized the entire case, transforming it from an abstract policy discussion to a profound human story about values betrayed and oaths dishonored. As the day's proceedings concluded, Attorney General Washington announced that based on the testimony presented, her office would be recommending a complete restructuring of the Pinecrest Police Department under federal consent decree, criminal charges against specific officers, including Grayson and Lowell, and a comprehensive review of all cases involving potentially discriminatory enforcement patterns over the past decade. Outside the auditorium, as twilight settled over Pinecrest, community members gathered spontaneously on the City Hall steps. There were no speeches or formal statements, just the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted in a power structure that had seemed immutable for generations. Among them stood Jallen King, no longer just a teenager unjustly detained, but a catalyst for transformation that would reshape his community for decades to come. What none of them could fully appreciate in that moment was how the ripple effects from Pinecrest would soon reach communities across the country, as the federal investigation into extremist influence in local policing expanded to include departments in 7 states, ultimately leading to one of the most significant civil rights initiatives of the decade. 1 year after the federal hearing that exposed the systemic discrimination within the Pinecrest Police Department, the community gathered again, this time on the sunlit lawn of the newly established Justice and Public Safety Center. The modern, glass and brick building had replaced the old police headquarters, its architecture deliberately transparent and accessible, symbolizing the transformed relationship between law enforcement and the community it served. Jallen King, now 17 and preparing for college, stood at the podium addressing the assembled crowd of residents, officials, and media representatives. "A year ago, I was handcuffed in a cell for asserting my constitutional rights," he began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become his trademark. "Today, I stand before you as part of a community that has turned pain into progress and injustice into innovation. What happened to me was never just about one incident or one officer. It was about systems that had failed for generations and the courage of many people who refused to accept that failure as inevitable. The journey from that cell to this podium had been neither straight nor simple. The federal investigation had ultimately resulted in criminal charges against Officer Richard Grayson and Chief Bradley Lowell for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and in Lowell's case, financial crimes related to department funding. 3 other officers faced lesser charges for their participation in discriminatory practices, while the majority of the department underwent comprehensive retraining under the federal consent decree that now governed Pinecrest's approach to public safety. Former Sergeant Miguel Alvarez, whose whistleblower testimony had been crucial to the case, now served as interim director of the new Department of Public Safety, overseeing the implementation of reforms that had made Pinecrest a national model for community-centered policing. The transformation extended far beyond personnel changes. Every aspect of public safety in Pinecrest had been reimagined, from how calls for service were categorized and responded to the metrics used for evaluating officer performance, to the civilian oversight mechanisms that ensured transparency and accountability. Mental health professionals now responded alongside officers to certain calls. Specialized units addressed community needs, from youth engagement to elder services, and a citizen review board with substantive authority reviewed all use of force, incidents, and complaint investigations. For Commander Isaiah King, the Pinecrest case had prompted profound personal and professional recalibration. After 2 decades of military service, much of it spent defending American ideals in distant lands, he had made the difficult decision to retire from active duty to focus on healing the divisions in his own community. "I've spent my career fighting for principles of justice and equality in places thousands of miles from home," he explained during the ceremony marking his retirement from Special Forces. "It took my son's experience to show me that those same principles need dedicated defenders right here." Isaiah now directed the Constitutional Policing Initiative, a non-profit organization working with law enforcement agencies nationwide to implement the lessons learned from Pinecrest's transformation. His unique background in both military operations and constitutional law made him exceptionally effective at bridging the gap between security concerns and civil liberties protections, helping departments move beyond the false choice between public safety and constitutional rights. Tanya King had also found her experience transformed into unexpected purpose. What began as advocacy for her son expanded into a comprehensive academic study of community-based accountability mechanisms in law enforcement. Her research now informed policy development at state and federal levels, with Pinecrest serving as a primary case study in how determined citizenship could catalyze institutional change. The auditorium at Pinecrest Community College, where she presented her findings, regularly overflowed with students and community members eager to understand and build upon the Pinecrest model. For the broader community, especially its Black and Latino residents, the transformation represented something more fundamental than policy reform. It was the long overdue recognition of their full citizenship and equal protection under law. Children who had grown up being taught to fear police encounters now participated in community safety programs, where officers served as mentors, rather than intimidating authority figures. Neighborhoods previously subject to aggressive enforcement now hosted regular dialogue sessions where residents and public safety officials collaboratively identified and addressed community concerns. Even former Officer Richard Grayson had experienced a form of transformation, though his path was considerably more difficult. As part of his plea agreement, he had provided crucial testimony about the extremist training programs that had shaped his approach to policing, helping federal authorities dismantle networks that had been spreading unconstitutional enforcement philosophies to departments nationwide. While serving his reduced sentence, he participated in a restorative justice program, directly confronting the harm his actions had caused to community members, including Jallen. Their facilitated conversation, painful and brutally honest, became a case study in the possibility of accountability without dehumanization. As Jallen concluded his address at the Justice Center dedication, he introduced the initiative that would be his own legacy before he departed for college, the student rights education program that would be implemented in schools throughout the district. "Knowledge is the foundation of freedom," he told the assembled students who had joined the ceremony. "Understanding your rights and responsibilities as citizens isn't just academic. It's essential to maintaining the democracy my father and countless others have sacrificed to defend. This program will ensure that every student graduates not just with academic knowledge, but with practical understanding of how to navigate interactions with authority while maintaining both their rights and their dignity." The thunderous applause that followed reflected more than approval for a well-delivered speech. It represented a community's recognition that transformation, while catalyzed by crisis, ultimately depends on new generations equipped with both knowledge and courage to sustain it. Later that evening, as the King family shared a quiet dinner at home, Isaiah reflected on the journey they had undertaken together. "When I was deployed, I used to worry about missing the important moments in your life," he told Jallen. "I never imagined that the most important one would involve something like this. You've changed more lives through your courage than most of my military operations ever did." Jallen considered this for a moment before responding. "The difference is that you gave me the foundation to stand on. Everything you taught me about dignity, about rights, about perseverance, that's what got me through that cell and everything that came after. We did this together." As their conversation continued into the evening, touching on Jallen's college plans and Isaiah's new civilian career, the significance of their family's journey extended far beyond their dining room table. Across Pinecrest and increasingly across the country, the ripple effects of one teenager's stand against injustice and one father's return to defend American principles at home rather than abroad were transforming how communities understood the relationship between citizenship, authority, and justice. What began with a moment of humiliation and handcuffs had catalyzed a movement that would reshape American policing for generations to come, proving that systems once thought immutable could indeed be transformed when courage, evidence, and opportunity converged. Has a personal experience ever motivated you to stand up against injustice, or have you witnessed someone else's brave stand make a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and transformation. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through one family's fight for justice that became a blueprint for nationwide change. Remember, change begins with a single voice willing to speak truth to power, and that voice could be yours. The story of Jallen King powerfully illustrates that justice often requires extraordinary courage from ordinary people. When systems of discrimination become entrenched, it takes both individual bravery and collective action to create meaningful change. Jallen's refusal to accept mistreatment, combined with his father's strategic expertise and his mother's unwavering support, created a formula for transformation that rippled far beyond their personal experience. This narrative reminds us that documentation is power. By recording interactions, collecting evidence, and building networks of witnesses, victims of discrimination can transform isolated incidents into patterns that demand attention. Knowledge of rights serves as both shield and sword, protecting individuals during confrontations while empowering them to challenge unjust systems. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that institutional change requires pressure from multiple directions. Legal challenges, media attention, community organizing, and insider whistleblowers all played crucial roles in Pinecrest's transformation. No single approach would have succeeded alone. The journey from victimization to empowerment isn't immediate or easy, but each step toward justice creates pathways for others to follow. By understanding our rights, documenting abuses, building strategic alliances, and persistently demanding accountability, we can transform even the most entrenched systems of discrimination into models of equitable justice. Has there been a moment when you witnessed or experienced discrimination and wished you had known how to respond effectively? Share your story in the comments below to help others learn from your experience. If you believe in creating communities where everyone is treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race, hit that like button to stand in solidarity with this message. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that highlight both the challenges of systemic racism and the inspiring ways people are creating change. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message of transformation and hope, please share this video with them. Thank you for being part of this important conversation about justice, accountability, and the power of ordinary citizens to create extraordinary change. Together, we can build communities where everyone's rights are respected and protected.